The arena floor trembled beneath Kexthan's massive feet as he roared in triumph, his forearms raised toward the crimson sky of Vorthak Prime. Blood from his latest opponent dripped from his razor-sharp claws, pooling in the ancient stone beneath him. The crowd of alien spectators erupted in a mixture of cheers and terrified whispers. Another challenger had fallen, another world's champion reduced to nothing more than scattered remains. Kexthan stood 12 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming like polished obsidian in the arena's harsh lights. His species, the Vorthakians, had conquered 17 star systems through pure martial prowess, and he was their ultimate weapon. For 15 years he had remained undefeated in the Empire's grand arena, where warriors from across the galaxy came to test their might against the strongest being in known space. Emperor Zexavil watched from his golden throne high above the arena floor. His serpentine form coiled in satisfaction. The Empire's expansion had slowed in recent months due to stubborn resistance from several frontier worlds, but Kexthan's victories served as powerful propaganda. Who would dare oppose an empire that produced such invincible warriors? "Bring forth the next challenger." Kexthan's voice boomed across the arena, translated into a dozen languages by the universal communicators embedded in the walls. His primary eyes scanned the crowd while his secondary eyes tracked the movements of the arena guards, a predator's instinct honed by countless battles. The massive gates at the arena's edge groaned open, and a figure stepped into the bloody sand. The crowd fell silent, confusion rippling through the stands. This was not what they expected. The challenger was small, barely reaching Kexthan's waist. Its form was bipedal and seemed almost fragile compared to the muscular titans who usually face the champion. It wore strange, dark clothing that seemed to absorb light, and its face was completely hidden behind a mask that covered everything except pale, calculating eyes. "What is this?" Kexthan's voice carried a note of amusement as he studied the tiny figure. "Has the Empire run out of real warriors? Do they send children to face me now?" The mysterious challenger said nothing, simply assuming a low stance that seemed oddly fluid, like water preparing to flow. Its movements were silent, eerily so, as if it barely disturbed the air around it. Emperor Zexavil leaned forward on his throne, his interest piqued. The creature's species was unfamiliar to him, though recent intelligence reports had mentioned encounters with a new race calling themselves humans on the Empire's outer rim. Could this be one of them? Kexthan decided to end this farce quickly. He charged forward with the speed of a plasma bolt, his forearms extended to tear this insolent creature apart. In the past, such attacks had been more than sufficient to overwhelm even the most skilled opponents. But something impossible happened. The small figure simply wasn't there anymore. Kexthan's charge carried him past the spot where his opponent had been standing, his claws finding only empty air. He spun around, confusion and anger building in his chest, searching for his target. A whisper of movement behind him made his secondary eyes swivel, but again, nothing was there. The arena had fallen completely silent now, 20,000 spectators holding their breath as they witnessed something unprecedented. Kexthan had never missed a target before. "Show yourself, coward," he roared, his voice echoing off the arena walls. "Face me with honor!" A sound like gentle laughter seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When Kexthan spun toward where he thought it originated, he found only shadows and empty space. Then, impossibly, he felt something touch his arm. It was the lightest contact, barely perceptible even to his enhanced senses, but it sent a shock through his system. He looked down to see a thin line of his own purple blood seeping through a gap in his supposedly impenetrable exoskeleton. How was this possible? His armor had withstood plasma cannons, molecular disruptors, and the fangs of the great sandworms of Kepler-7. Yet this tiny creature had somehow found a microscopic weakness and exploited it with surgical precision. The human, for that's what it was, though Kexthan didn't know this yet, materialized from seemingly nowhere, now standing 15 feet away. Its posture remained relaxed, almost casual, as if the greatest warrior in the Empire posed no threat whatsoever. "You move like a charging Rothhawk," the human said, its voice barely above a whisper yet somehow carrying clearly across the arena. "Powerful but predictable. On my world we learned long ago that the mightiest tree can be felled by the patient application of a small blade in exactly the right place." Kexthan's rage reached new heights. No one had ever spoken to him with such casual dismissal, such complete lack of fear. He was death incarnate, the nightmare that enemy worlds whispered about in the darkness. He attacked again, this time with more cunning, using feints and misdirection that had served him well against clever opponents. But the human moved like smoke, like shadow, always just beyond reach. Worse, with each failed attack, Kexthan found new cuts appearing on his body. Tiny wounds that shouldn't have been possible but were nonetheless real. The crowd began to murmur, then to buzz with nervous energy. Some had begun to leave their seats, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The Empire's propaganda machine had spent decades convincing them that Vorthakian supremacy was absolute, that their warriors were unstoppable forces of nature. Yet here was this small, quiet creature making their champion look clumsy and slow. Emperor Zexvil's claws dug into the armrests of his throne as he watched his greatest asset being systematically dismantled. Intelligence reports about human resistance in the outer colonies suddenly took on new significance. If this was what a single human could do to Kexthan, what could an army of them accomplish? As the strange dance of predator and prey continued below, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The age of Vorthakian invincibility was about to end, and the Empire would never be the same again. The humans circled Kexthan like a planet orbiting a dying star, patient and inexorable, while the champion's movements grew increasingly desperate and wild. The arena's medical sensors began flashing warning signals as Kexthan's vital signs showed signs of distress. Not physical exhaustion. The Vorthakian champion could fight for days without tiring, but something far more dangerous. Psychological strain. For the first time in his life, doubt crept into his mind like poison spreading through his veins. The human continued its relentless, silent assault. Each attack Kexthan launched was met with empty air, while more impossible wounds appeared across his supposedly invulnerable hide. The cuts were precise, targeted, designed not to kill but to weaken and confuse. His left secondary arm had lost feeling below the elbow. His right leg had developed a slight tremor that threw off his balance. "What are you?" Kexthan gasped, his breathing becoming labored for the first time in decades of combat. The human paused in its movements, and for a moment stood perfectly still in the center of the arena. When it spoke, its voice carried across the silent stadium with crystalline clarity. "I am Kenji Nakamura, and I represent the people of Earth." The name meant nothing to the alien audience, but the way he said it carried weight, like a formal declaration of war. "My ancestors called warriors like me ninja, shadows who serve the light, those who fight not for glory, but for freedom." Emperor Zexvil's communication officers were frantically accessing their databases, searching for any information about this Earth and its inhabitants. What they found made the Emperor's blood run cold. Earth was listed as a recently contacted world on the Empire's outer rim, designated for standard conquest protocols. The preliminary reports had dismissed it as militarily insignificant. The humans had no advanced weapons, no space fleet of consequence, no apparent superhuman abilities. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards, their bodies fragile compared to most sentient species. But buried in the detailed files was information that the conquest planners had apparently overlooked. Earth's history was drenched in blood and conflict spanning millennia. These humans had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting each other, developing tactics and strategies that other species couldn't comprehend because they had never needed such sophisticated approaches to warfare, while the Empire's subject races had developed strength and technology to overcome their enemies. Humans had developed something far more dangerous, the ability to turn weakness into strength, to find victory through methods that seemed impossible to more straightforward minds. The ninja tradition was just one example. Warriors who struck from shadows, who used their enemy's strength against them, who could kill with a touch or disappear like morning mist. The Empire's analysts had dismissed such accounts as primitive mythology, unable to believe that any species could develop such abilities without advanced technology. They were learning otherwise. Down in the arena, Kexthan made one final desperate assault. He abandoned all technique, all strategy, and simply charged with every ounce of power his massive frame could generate. The stone floor cracked beneath his feet as he thundered toward the human, all forearms extended, claws that could shred titanium reaching for his tormentor. Kenji waited until the last possible second, then stepped aside with fluid grace. As Kexthan's momentum carried him past, The ninja's hand moved in a motion too quick for even the arena's high-speed cameras to capture clearly. Kexthan stumbled, then stopped. He looked down in confusion at his chest where his primary heart was located. A small, almost insignificant mark had appeared over the organ, barely more than a pinprick through his exoskeleton. But the champion of the Empire knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of violence, that he was going to die. "How?" he whispered, sinking to his knees as his strength fled his body. Kenji stood before him, no longer the silent shadow but now speaking with the voice of judgment itself. "Your people have conquered 17 star systems through strength alone. You understand only the philosophy of the hammer, where every problem is a nail to be smashed. But there are other ways to fight, other ways to win." The human reached up and pulled away his mask, revealing a surprisingly young face marked by old scars and eyes that held depths of sadness and determination. "On Earth we learned that even the mightiest fortress has weak points. Every armor has gaps. Every giant has pressure points that, when struck precisely, can bring them down." Kexthan's vision was beginning to fade, but he forced himself to focus on the human's words. "Your empire sends overwhelming force against worlds that cannot match your military might. You rely on fear, on the belief that resistance is futile. But you made one critical error when you decided to invade Earth." The champion tried to speak, but found his voice failing along with his strength. "You gave us time to study you," Kenji continued, his voice carrying across the now silent arena to reaches every listener. "Your advanced forces, your scout ships, your preliminary surveys, all of them provided us with data about your species, your technology, your tactics. While you saw a primitive world ready for easy conquest, we saw an opportunity to learn everything about our enemies before they knew we were enemies at all." Emperor Zexville rose from his throne, his serpentine form trembling with rage and fear. This was more than a simple combat defeat. This was a complete intelligence failure, a systematic breakdown of everything the Empire thought it knew about warfare. Every pressure point, every vulnerable spot, every weakness in your anatomy and your technology. "We found them all," Kenji said, his words now broadcast across the Empire's communication networks by news feeds that had been covering what should have been a routine execution. "And we have had 3 years to prepare for your arrival." Kexthan collapsed completely, his massive form hitting the arena floor with a sound like falling stone. He was not dead. The ninja had been too precise for that, but he would never fight again. The strike had severed specific nerve clusters that controlled his motor functions, leaving him helpless but alive to serve as a living reminder of this day. The silence in the arena stretched for long moments as the reality of what had just occurred sank into the minds of 20,000 spectators. The Empire's greatest warrior, the symbol of Vorthakian invincibility, lay broken before a human who stood barely half his height. When Kenji spoke again, his voice was no longer addressing the fallen champion, but rather the Emperor himself and the vast audience watching across the Empire's territory. "This is our message to your Empire," he said, looking directly up at the royal box where Emperor Zexville sat frozen in shock. "Earth will not be another easy conquest. We are not like the other worlds you have absorbed. We have been preparing for war since the day your first scout ship entered our system, and we have learned to fight in ways you cannot imagine." The human warrior walked toward the arena's exit, his movements once again becoming silent and fluid. As he reached the massive gates, he turned back one final time. "Tell your legions, tell your admirals, tell your entire military command. Earth remembers every invasion in our history, every attempt at conquest, every would-be conqueror who thought we were too small and weak to resist. We remember how each one ended. The gates sealed behind him, leaving 20,000 beings to contemplate a galaxy that had suddenly become much more dangerous and uncertain than they had ever imagined." 3 weeks after the arena incident, the Empire's war machine lurched into motion like a sleeping beast awakened by an insult. Admiral Thekmore stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Void Ripper, watching through the massive viewports as the largest invasion fleet in galactic history assembled around him. 500 warships carrying 2 million of the Empire's finest soldiers, all aimed at one small blue world on the galaxy's outer rim. Emperor Zexville had made the decision in a fit of rage and wounded pride. The footage of Kexthan's defeat had spread across the Empire's territory faster than any official channels could contain it. Rebellions had sparked on 3 conquered worlds. Resistance movements were growing bolder, and the Empire's carefully cultivated image of invincibility lay in tatters. Earth would pay for this humiliation, and it would pay in blood. Admiral Thekmore reviewed the tactical data once more as the fleet prepared for its final jump to the human system. Intelligence suggested Earth had no significant space defenses, no orbital weapons platforms, no fleet capable of challenging even a single Imperial dreadnought. Their technology was centuries behind Imperial standards. This should be a simple extermination mission. Yet doubt gnawed at the Admiral's mind like an infection. The human in the arena had demonstrated capabilities that defied explanation. If one human could do the impossible, what might an entire world of them accomplish? "Admiral," his communications officer reported. "We're receiving a transmission from the target system." "Put it through," Thekmore commanded. Curious despite himself, the main view screen flickered to life, showing the image of a human female. She was middle-aged by their species standards, wearing simple clothing that suggested civilian rather than military status. Behind her, Thekmore could see what appeared to be a modest office or command center, nothing that looked particularly threatening. "I am Director Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Coalition," the human said, her voice calm and professional. "I assume you are Admiral Thekmore, commander of the Imperial invasion fleet currently approaching our system." Thekmore's secondary arms clenched involuntarily. How did they know his name? How did they even know he was coming? Their intelligence networks couldn't possibly have penetrated Imperial security so thoroughly. "Human," he began, injecting all the authority and menace he could muster into his voice. "You will surrender your world immediately and submit to Imperial authority. Any resistance will result in the complete annihilation of your species." Director Chen smiled, and something about that expression made Thekmore's blood run cold. It was the same kind of patient, predatory smile the ninja had worn in the arena. "I'm afraid we must respectfully decline your generous offer," she said. "However, we would like to extend a counter-proposal. You have exactly 1 hour to reverse course and leave our system. Any Imperial vessel remaining in Earth space after that deadline will be considered an act of war." The bridge erupted in sounds that might have been laughter if they hadn't come from alien throats. The idea that a primitive world with no space fleet was threatening the Empire's mightiest armada was beyond absurd. "You have no fleet, human," Admiral Thekmore replied. "You have no weapons capable of harming our ships. Your threats are meaningless." "Admiral," Director Chen said, and now her voice carried a note of something that might have been pity. "Has your intelligence service taught you nothing about human history? We've been fighting wars for over 10,000 years. We've learned a few things along the way." The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial bridge in confused silence. Exactly 58 minutes later, Thekmore learned what Director Chen had meant. The first sign of trouble was when the destroyer plasma fang simply vanished from sensors. One moment it was maintaining standard formation on the fleet's outer perimeter, the next it was gone. No explosion, no distress signal, no debris field, just empty space where a 200-meter warship had been. "Sensor malfunction," Thekmore's tactical officer reported, but his voice lacked conviction. Then the light cruiser Death's Edge disappeared. Then the assault carrier Stormbringer. One by one, ships on the fleet's edges were simply ceasing to exist, removed from reality as efficiently as a surgeon removing tumors. "Admiral," the communications officer called out, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm receiving a transmission from the Fist of Conquest. They report being boarded by unknown hostiles." On the tactical display, the positions of the remaining ships began to shift as panicked captains broke formation, trying to understand an enemy they couldn't see or comprehend. "How are they getting aboard our ships?" Thekmore demanded. "Where are their boarding craft?" "Their fighters?" His tactical officer's hands were shaking as he worked his console. "Sir, I'm not detecting any enemy vessels at all. Long-range sensors show empty space in all directions." The truth, though none of the Imperial forces would understand it for hours yet, was elegantly simple. The humans had indeed spent 3 years preparing for this invasion, and they had learned from every contact with Imperial technology. They knew exactly how Imperial sensors worked, exactly what frequencies they monitored, exactly what signatures they looked for. So humanity had built ships that were invisible to those sensors, not through advanced shielding or exotic technologies, but through careful engineering and centuries of experience in the art of stealth. Human vessels hung in the void like ghosts, their hulls designed to absorb rather than reflect sensor sweeps. their engines running silent and cold. They had been waiting in Earth's outer system for weeks, watching the Imperial fleet approach, studying its formations and tactics through long-range observation. Now they struck with the precision of a surgical knife and the sudden violence of a thunderclap. Aboard the stealth destroyer New Tokyo, Captain Maria Santos watched through her periscope as her torpedo found its target. The Imperial cruiser's shields flared briefly, then failed as the human weapon, designed specifically to disrupt Imperial defensive systems, tore through its hull like paper. Target destroyed, her weapons officer reported with quiet satisfaction. Moving to secondary target, the torpedo hadn't been a conventional explosive. Human engineers working from captured Imperial technology samples had developed something far more elegant, a weapon that could overload Imperial power systems from the inside, causing enemy ships to literally tear themselves apart with their own energy. It was a very human approach to warfare, turning the enemy's strength into weakness through superior understanding and preparation. Admiral Thekmore watched his fleet dissolve around him like ice in acid. Ships that had conquered star systems were being destroyed by enemies he couldn't even see, weapons he couldn't understand, tactics that defied everything he thought he knew about space combat. Admiral, his communications officer shouted over the growing chaos. "I'm receiving another transmission from the human world." Director Chen appeared on screen again, but now she was standing in what was clearly a military command center. Behind her, Thekmore could see massive displays showing the positions of every ship in his fleet, tracking their movements with impossible precision. "Admiral Thekmore," she said, her voice still calm despite the battle raging around them, "you now have 15 minutes to order your remaining vessels to withdraw from Earth space. After that, we will consider you enemy combatants and respond accordingly." "This is impossible," Thekmore roared at the screen. "You're a primitive species. You don't have the technology for this." Director Chen's smile returned, and this time it definitely looked predatory. "Admiral, you made the same mistake your champion made in our arena. You assumed that superior strength was the only path to victory. You never considered that we might have spent our preparation time learning to fight smarter rather than harder." Behind her, one of the human technicians called out a report. "Ma'am, we have positive locks on all remaining Imperial vessels. Stealth fleet reports ready for final assault." "You see, Admiral," Director Chen continued, "humans have a saying, know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. We spent 3 years getting to know you very, very well." The transmission ended just as another Imperial ship exploded in the distance, its death throes lighting up the void like a dying star. Admiral Thekmore stood frozen on his command deck, watching his mighty fleet die around him. In 30 minutes of combat, 3/4 of his vessels had been destroyed or disabled by an enemy he still couldn't see. The remaining ships were trapped in a sphere of invisible hunters that struck without warning and vanished like smoke. But Thekmore had not risen to his rank through cowardice. If these humans wanted a fight, he would give them one they would never forget. His remaining ships still outgunned anything the primitives could field, if he could just find them. "All vessels begin random saturation bombardment of surrounding space," he commanded. "Maximum spread all frequencies. If we can't see them, we'll force them to reveal themselves." The response was immediate and devastating. Every surviving Imperial ship opened fire simultaneously, filling the void around them with enough energy to sterilize a small moon. Plasma cannons, particle beams, and molecular disruptors painted space in brilliant colors as they sought invisible targets. For a moment, Thekmore thought he had found the answer. Surely no stealth system could hide from such overwhelming firepower. He was wrong. The human ships weren't just invisible, they were mobile, slipping between the wild energy bursts like dancers avoiding raindrops. Worse, the Imperial barrage was revealing far more about Imperial positions than it was about human ones. Captain Santos smiled grimly as she watched the enemy fleet expose itself so completely. "Tactical, mark all firing positions. Weapons, prepare full spread of hunter-killers." "Aye, Captain." All tubes loaded and ready. The human torpedoes that launched in response to the Imperial bombardment were unlike anything in the Empire's arsenal. Instead of massive warheads designed for brute force destruction, they were small, intelligent, and patient. Each one carried advanced sensor packages and adaptive AI systems that could learn and react to enemy countermeasures in real time. They were called hunter-killers. For good reason. Admiral Thekmore's first warning was when his flagship's defensive systems detected incoming projectiles, but by then it was far too late. The human weapons had been studying Imperial point defense systems for the entire battle, learning their patterns, their timing, their blind spots. The hunter-killers struck like surgical strikes, each one finding the exact weak point in their target's defenses that would cause maximum damage with minimum effort. Imperial ships that had seemed invulnerable moments before began exploding in chain reactions as their own power systems turned against them. "Sir," Thekmore's tactical officer called out in desperation, "the enemy weapons are adapting faster than we can counter them. They're learning from every defensive measure we deploy." It was true. The human AI systems were absorbing data from every Imperial response, sharing that information instantly across the entire stealth fleet. What had begun as a technological disadvantage was rapidly becoming a decisive edge through superior information processing and adaptation. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. "Admiral," his communications officer said, his voice hollow with shock. "I'm receiving signals from across the Empire. It's not just us. Human forces have appeared in 17 different systems simultaneously." The tactical display shifted to show a galactic map, and Thekmore's primary heart nearly stopped. Red markers indicated combat zones across the Empire's territory, each one representing an impossible human attack on worlds that should have been completely secure. Director Chen's voice filled the bridge once more, but this time the transmission was coming from multiple sources across the galaxy. "Admiral Thekmore, let me explain what you're seeing," she said, her image now flanked by other humans in military uniforms. "For 3 years, we've been inserting small teams throughout your territory, not as conquerors but as students, learning your systems, your procedures, your weaknesses." Behind her, the displays showed real-time footage from across the Empire, human commando teams emerging from hiding places they had maintained for years, striking with precision at critical infrastructure points that the Empire had never thought to guard. "Every world you conquered, every species you enslaved, we contacted in secret," Director Chen continued. "We shared our knowledge, our techniques, our understanding of your vulnerabilities. Today, they use that knowledge to reclaim their freedom." The scope of the human operation was staggering. While the Empire had been focused on Earth as a primitive target for easy conquest, humanity had been conducting the largest intelligence and coordination effort in galactic history. They had turned the Empire's own size and complexity against it, using its vast communication networks and trade routes to spread their influence like a virus through a computer system. On Kepler 7th, the Sandworm riders who had been enslaved decades earlier struck at Imperial mining operations with weapons that could penetrate Vorthakian armor. On Centauri Beta, the aquatic Merlani used human-designed submersibles to attack the underwater cities where their oppressors lived. On Rigel Prime, the telepathic Zenith employed human-taught mental disciplines to coordinate simultaneous uprisings across an entire continent. Each rebellion was small, focused, and precisely targeted. None of them tried to match Imperial strength directly. Instead, they struck at exactly the points where the Empire was weakest, using tactics that turned the Empire's rigid command structure into a liability rather than an asset. "You see, Admiral," Director Chen said as another Imperial ship died in the background, "you made one fundamental error in your approach to conquest. You assumed that strength was the only currency that mattered in war. But humans learned long ago that the strongest army in the world is useless if it can't find its enemies, and the mightiest fleet ever assembled can be defeated by opponents who understand its weaknesses better than it understands itself." Admiral Thekmore looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. For the first time in their lives, these hardened veterans of a dozen conquest campaigns were experiencing something they had never felt before: the cold certainty of defeat. The Empire's military doctrine was based on overwhelming superiority and direct confrontation. They had never developed tactics for fighting an enemy that refused to engage on those terms, an enemy that had studied them for years before striking, an enemy that turned their own strength into weakness through superior knowledge and preparation. "This ends now, human," Thekmore roared at the screen. "I will ram my ship directly into your world. I will personally ensure that your species burns for this." Director Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold and final entered her eyes. "Admiral, you still don't understand. This isn't a battle between our species and yours. This is the Empire's enslaved worlds finally fighting back with the tools we've given them. Your own subjects are rising against you, and we're simply helping them do it more effectively." She paused, then delivered the final blow with quiet precision. "The age of empires built on strength alone is over. From now on, survival will require intelligence, adaptability, and the wisdom to know when cooperation serves better than conquest. Your empire has none of those qualities." The transmission ended just as the last of Admiral Thekmore's escort vessels exploded in the distance. His flagship hung alone in space, surrounded by invisible enemies and facing a galaxy that would never again fear the Empire's military might. For the first time in over 2 centuries, the Vorthakian Empire was truly afraid. Emperor Zexavil coiled tighter around his throne as reports flooded in from across his crumbling empire. The massive holographic display in his war room showed red warning lights spreading like an infection through 17 star systems. Each light represented worlds in open rebellion, imperial installations destroyed, or entire sectors going dark as communication networks failed. The human operation was even more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. For 3 years, while the Empire had dismissed Earth as another primitive world awaiting conquest, human agents had been infiltrating every level of imperial society. They had posed as traitors, diplomats, refugees, even slaves. Anything that would give them access to imperial systems and oppressed populations. "Your Majesty," General Kraktos reported, his voice strained with exhaustion and fear. "We've lost contact with the entire Rigel sector. The last transmission indicated coordinated attacks on all major imperial installations. The rebels seem to know exactly where to strike for maximum damage." The Emperor's serpentine form writhed with rage. "How is this possible? How could a species of primitives coordinate such an operation across hundreds of light years?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Chief Intelligence Officer Velthar, a member of the Empire's most analytical species, the crystalline Silmari. Her multifaceted form sparked with nervous energy as she approached the throne. "Your Majesty, I believe the humans have been using our own communication networks against us," she said, her harmonic voice carrying overtones of professional admiration mixed with terror. "They didn't need to build a massive infrastructure for coordination. They simply piggybacked on ours." She activated a smaller holographic display showing the Empire's vast subspace communication grid. Every message we sent, every data packet we transmitted, every routine status report, the humans were intercepting and analyzing it all. They used our own network to coordinate with their agents and with resistance movements we didn't even know existed. The scope of the intelligence failure was staggering. For decades, the Empire had believed that their overwhelming military might made subterfuge unnecessary. Who needed spies when you could simply conquer? Who needed intelligence gathering when brute force could solve any problem? The humans had turned that philosophy into a fatal weakness. "Show me Earth," the Emperor commanded. His voice barely controlled fury. The display shifted to show the human homeworld, a small blue marble that seemed utterly insignificant compared to the Empire's vast holdings. But now that insignificant world was broadcasting signals to every corner of Imperial space, coordinating the largest rebellion in galactic history. "Your Majesty," Velthar continued hesitantly, "there's something else. Our xenobiology teams have been analyzing the human who defeated Kexthan. The results are disturbing." "Explain." "The human showed physical capabilities that should be impossible for their species based on our biological assessments. Enhanced reflexes, perfect muscle control, resistance to fatigue, but it wasn't through genetic enhancement or cybernetic augmentation. It was through training." The crystalline being's form flickered with patterns that indicated deep concern. "Your Majesty, I believe the humans have developed methods of physical and mental conditioning that allow them to exceed their natural limitations through will and technique alone. If one human can achieve such capabilities, what might an entire population of trained humans accomplish?" Emperor Zexful had been asking himself the same question. The reports filtering in from the rebellion showed a disturbing pattern. Wherever humans appeared to assist local resistance movements, Imperial forces found themselves outmaneuvered, outthought, and systematically dismantled despite having superior numbers and firepower. The humans weren't just helping the rebellions. They were teaching entire species how to fight like humans. "Sir." Communications Officer Havlek called out urgently. "We're receiving a transmission addressed directly to you, Your Majesty. The source appears to be Earth itself." "Put it through," the Emperor commanded, though part of him dreaded what he was about to hear. The holographic display shifted to show a human male, elderly by their species standards, wearing simple civilian clothing. Behind him stood an array of other humans representing different age groups and ethnicities, but all sharing the same calm, determined expression that was becoming disturbingly familiar. "Emperor Zexville," the human said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority despite his unremarkable appearance. "I am Secretary General Harrison Walsh of the United Earth Coalition. I speak for all of humanity in this matter." The Emperor's advisors shifted nervously around the throne room. This human showed none of the fear or deference that other species demonstrated when addressing imperial authority. If anything, he seemed to be regarding the Emperor as an equal, or perhaps even as something slightly disappointing. "You will order your forces to withdraw from all systems currently in rebellion," Secretary General Walsh continued matter-of-factly. "You will grant immediate independence to any world that requests it. You will provide reparations to the species. You have enslaved and compensation for the resources. You have stolen from their worlds." The audacity of the demands left the entire imperial court stunned into silence. A species that had possessed spaceflight for less than a century was dictating terms to an empire that had ruled the galaxy for over 2 millennia. "And if we refuse?" Emperor Zexville asked, his voice dripping with menace. Secretary General Walsh smiled, the same patient, predatory expression that was becoming the Empire's newest nightmare. "Then we will demonstrate why every successful empire in human history eventually learned to fear the sound of our footsteps in the dark." Behind him, the other humans moved slightly, and the Emperor noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Each of them wore small insignia indicating different human military traditions. Navy SEALs, British SAS, Russian Spetsnaz, Israeli Mossad, Chinese People's Liberation Army Special Forces, Japanese Special Forces Group, and dozens of other organizations whose names meant nothing to Imperial intelligence, but whose reputation for lethality was apparently well established among humans. "Your Majesty," Secretary General Walsh said, his voice now carrying undertones of iron, "humanity has spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of warfare against opponents who seemed impossible to defeat. Romans, Mongols, Nazis, colonial empires, all of them believed they were unstoppable. All of them learned otherwise." The display shifted to show historical footage from Earth's past, massive armies being defeated by smaller, better-trained forces, technologically superior invaders being driven out by defenders who knew their homeland better, empire after empire collapsing when their subjects finally learned to coordinate their resistance. "We have studied every form of warfare, every type of resistance, every method of turning strength into weakness," the Secretary General continued. "We've had practice, lots of practice. And now we're going to teach the galaxy everything we've learned about fighting tyrants." The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial throne room in stunned silence. Emperor Zexville looked around at his advisors, seeing his own fear reflected in their faces. For the first time in the Empire's history, they were facing an enemy that seemed to understand warfare better than they did, an enemy that had turned their own strengths into vulnerabilities, an enemy that had spent years preparing for this exact confrontation. Outside the palace walls, reports continued to flood in of Imperial forces being defeated across the galaxy by rebels who fought with human tactics, human weapons, and human determination. The age of Imperial dominance was ending, and humanity was writing its epitaph in fire and freedom across the stars. 6 months after the Great Rebellion began, Emperor Zexville stood before the shattered remains of his throne room's viewing wall, watching the final Imperial transport, ships flee from Vorthak Prime. Behind him lay the ruins of an empire that had once spanned 17 star systems and commanded the loyalty of over 1 billion subjects. Now those subjects were free, and humanity had kept its promise to help them stay that way. The statistics were devastating to Imperial pride, but undeniable in their scope. 43 worlds had declared independence and made it stick. Imperial military strength had been reduced by 70%, through a combination of outright defeats, defections, and simple exhaustion. Most humiliating of all, over half of the Empire's former subjects had specifically requested human advisors to help them establish Their new governments, the galaxy was learning that humans didn't just excel at warfare, they were equally gifted at peace. In the former slave pits of Kepler-7, human engineers worked alongside liberated sandworm riders to design sustainable mining operations that respected both the planet's ecosystem and its inhabitants' traditional ways of life. On Centauri Beta, human marine biologists helped the Merlani establish underwater cities that enhanced rather than disrupted their oceanic environment. On Rigel Prime, human diplomats facilitated peace talks between different Zenith tribes that had been kept in artificial conflict by Imperial divide-and-conquer tactics, but it was on Earth itself that the most significant changes were taking place. Director Sarah Chen stood in the observation deck of Luna Station, watching the steady stream of ships arriving from across the galaxy, not warships or invasion fleets, but trade vessels, diplomatic transports, and refugee carriers filled with beings seeking to learn from the species that had accomplished the impossible. The latest reports from the outer colonies, her aide reported, handing her a data pad. The Rigel system has formally established the first multi-species democratic council in galactic history. The Andorian Federation is requesting human advisors for their constitutional convention, and the Zeta Reticuli worlds want to establish a permanent Earth embassy. Director Chen nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. Any word from the Imperial remnant? Intelligence suggests they've consolidated around their core worlds, but there's no indication they're planning any major offensive operations. Most of their remaining fleet is being used for planetary defense rather than force projection. It was, Chen reflected, exactly what human strategists had predicted. The Empire's entire military doctrine had been built around overwhelming offensive capability. When that capability was neutralized, they had no backup plan, no alternative strategy for maintaining control. Humans, on the other hand, had spent centuries developing systems that could function under any conditions. Democracy survived military coups, free markets adapted to economic warfare, and human culture thrived under occupation, oppression, and exile. It was this adaptability, more than any military prowess, that made humanity so effective at helping other species build sustainable independence. Ma'am, her aide continued, there's also a personal message for you from Admiral Techmore. Chen raised an eyebrow. The Imperial Admiral had survived the destruction of his fleet and had spent the last 6 months in a human prisoner of war facility. Unlike the brutal internment camps the Empire used for captured enemies, human POW facilities were designed around rehabilitation rather than punishment. It was, many former Imperial officers reported, disturbingly effective. Put it through, Chen said. Admiral Techmore's image appeared on the communication screen, but he looked nothing like the proud, arrogant commander who had threatened Earth 6 months earlier. His posture suggested someone who had spent considerable time in deep thought, and his eyes held an expression that Chen had learned to recognize in other former Imperial officers. The look of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt. Director Chen, he said, his voice carrying none of its former menace. I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to study at your military academy. It was true. As part of their rehabilitation program, humans offered captured Imperial officers the chance to study human military history, political science, and social theory. Many chose to do so out of simple boredom, but found themselves profoundly changed by exposure to concepts they had never encountered before. What did you think of the curriculum, Admiral? Chen asked. Disturbing, Techmore replied honestly. Your species has an almost pathological obsession with studying your own failures. Every defeat, every mistake, every tactical error, you analyze it all and learn from it. Most species try to forget their losses and glorify their victories. Humans seem to do the opposite, Chen smiled. And what conclusion did you draw from that observation? That this is why you win, the Admiral said simply. The Empire never learned from its mistakes because it never admitted to making any. We convinced ourselves that our strength made error impossible, that our power meant we were always right. But you humans seem to assume you're always on the verge of making some catastrophic mistake, so you prepare for everything. It was, Chen thought, a remarkably perceptive analysis. Human military doctrine was indeed built around the assumption that everything that could go wrong eventually would go wrong, and that victory belonged to whoever was best prepared to adapt when their original plans failed. There's something else, Admiral Thekmore continued. I've been reading your historical records of something called the Marshall Plan. Is it true that after defeating the Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany, you helped rebuild them as free societies? That's correct, Chen confirmed. Why? The question came out as a whisper, as if Thekmore was afraid of the answer. Because we learned that permanent victory comes from turning enemies into allies, not from keeping them weak enough to never threaten you again, Chen explained. Fear-based control is always temporary. Eventually, the oppressed become strong enough to fight back. But partners in mutual prosperity have no reason to fight at all. There was a long pause as the former Imperial Admiral processed this concept. Director Chen, he said finally, I would like to request permission to return to Vorthak Prime as part of a human diplomatic mission. I believe there are many in the Imperial Remnant who could benefit from the same educational opportunities I've received. Chen had been expecting this request. Over the past 6 months, dozens of former Imperial officers had volunteered to return to their homeworlds as advocates for peaceful coexistence. It was perhaps the most hopeful development in a conflict that had begun with seemingly irreconcilable differences. Permission granted, Admiral, she said. But I should warn you, many of your former colleagues will view you as a traitor. Thekmore's expression hardened into something that reminded Chen of the ninja who had started this entire transformation. Then I'll have to teach them what I learned about the difference between loyalty to a system and loyalty to the people that system claims to serve. The communication ended, leaving Chen alone with her thoughts. Outside Luna Station's viewports, ships from a dozen different species moved in carefully coordinated patterns, carrying diplomats, traders, scholars, and refugees to and from Earth. The sight would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier, but had become routine in the new galactic order. Humanity had won not by being stronger than the Empire, but by being smarter, more adaptable, and more willing to turn enemies into allies. The victory hadn't come through superior weapons or technology, but through superior understanding of the most fundamental principle of sustainable power, that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the wisdom to build systems where domination becomes unnecessary. In the end, the Empire's strongest warrior had been defeated not by a ninja's blade, but by a ninja's philosophy, the understanding that the greatest victories are won not through force, but through the patient application of intelligence, preparation, and the willingness to see weakness where others see only strength. The galaxy would never be the same, and humanity was just getting started.